Hello, everyone. Conan Doyle is credited as the initiator of modern fandom with his Sherlock Holmes character. And our keynote speaker is certainly one of the foremost contributors to the continued popularity of Holmes in the 20th century, with original stories in books and film. He has also done the same within that other example of exuberant fandom, Star Trek, screenwriting and directing some of the most popular Star Trek films and television. I won't spend time going over his impressive resume, but I encourage you to read it in the conference guide. But in honor of our distinguished guest, I would like to introduce him to you in Klingon. Nicholas Myers!
Dag, weg. Och, Ida. Greetings and many thanks. I didn't really know what the phrase "a tough act to follow" was until I was listening to all the presentations that were made here over the last 24 hours. And the phrase "keynote speaker" now weighs heavily upon me. I only hope we're not getting such a late start. I've been given 40 minutes, and if I'm not done, just walk out and I can take it in.
We're on time.
You know, it's great to be here in the city of brotherly love. What? Oh, never mind. So this, thank you, Miss. This is a little talk entitled "How and Why I Write What I Write with Why Saved for Last." I don't know how many of you are familiar. I know we're all familiar with Edgar Allan Poe. I don't know how many of you have read his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, but I'm going to summarize it, and there's a reason. Poe said, "I've often been asked how I write, and so I've decided by way of answering to explain how I wrote my most famous poem, The Raven." And he said, "This is a matter of nothing but logic, nothing but logic. Decision number one, I wanted to write a poem. Decision number two, how long should the poem be?" He said, "I only write short stories and poems. I've never written novels because I believe that a work of art, to be successful, has to be appreciable at a single sitting." So Poe faults Milton's Paradise Lost because you can't get it in one sitting. He said, "So I decided I would write a poem that was 100 lines long. The Raven is 108. He said, "Next, what is the subject of the poem? It is my contemplation," says Poe, "that the proper province of poetry is the contemplation of the beautiful. Everything else belongs to prose." So I now had a 100-line poem about something beautiful. What is the greatest kind of beauty I could think of? Sad beauty. What is the saddest beauty I could think of? Death. Whose death was the saddest I could imagine? The death of a maiden. I now had a 100-line poem about the death of a maiden. At this point, I decided I wanted to have a refrain, a chorus, something memorable, maybe even a phrase, a sentence, or a word. What's the saddest word I could think of? Nevermore. All right, I now had a 100-line poem about the death of a maiden and the refrain, this mournful nevermore. Nevermore is an answer. So who should be asking the questions? This is a no-brainer. The lover of the dead maiden. Who should be answering? There is something mechanical about this nevermore, nevermore business. So he said, I thought of a parrot. That a parrot is a comical bird. So I didn't want a parrot. But I remembered ravens could mimic human speech. And so I went with the raven. And now you also start to understand something of the perverse psychology of the lover who keeps framing his questions to the raven so as always to elicit this same remorseless reply. Last question, how do you get the lover and the raven together? First I thought of putting it in the raven's milieu, the woods, but this seemed to lack some of the claustrophobic, voluptuous intensity that I was after. So I put the lover in his study and have the raven tap, tap, tapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, only this and nothing more. Quoth the raven, nevermore. This is how Poe says he wrote the raven. Now there's, as I count them, 4 possibilities. 1, this is how he wrote the raven. 2, this is how he thinks he wrote the raven. 3, this is how he wishes he wrote the raven. And 4, this is how he would like to think you would think he wrote the raven. So this is as good a time to remind you that writers are liars. In fact, Plato didn't want writers in the Republic because we are liars. So I'm going to try to explain how and why and the rest of it I write, but you have to take all this with a ton of salt. Because if we can't explain something, and chances are we can't, we make up anecdotal evidence. I'm sure you've all heard the story in this room of how Gilbert says he wrote the Mikado, when a samurai sword hanging over his desk fell down and almost decapitated him. And he wasn't decapitated, but he held the samurai sword in his hand, and that's how he says he wrote the Mikado. 100 lines, raven, nevermore. You know, the Italians have a phrase for it, si non è vero è ben trovato. It isn't true, but it kind of sounds cool. You know that Socrates was told, this is like the first dinner which I've told the Socrates story. Socrates is told by the oracle at Delphi that he is the wisest man in Greece. And his response to this is, that can't be right. And so all I have to do to disprove the oracle is to find somebody wiser than me. So he goes talking to all segments of Greek society until finally he comes athwart the poets. And I think by poets he means artists, sculptors, and probably only men at the time. But he thinks surely these guys who have written and sculpted and painted so insightfully about the human condition are going to turn out to be wiser than I. He says, imagine my surprise when I found out the poets were the stupidest people I saw. He said, they were like children, just infantile, except when they did their art, at which time they appeared to go into a kind of trance, during which time they take dictation from God. And this they call inspiration. And then when it's over, they come out, they don't know where they've been, and they go back to being jerks again. I'm sure it's different in Greek. I would also like to say, this is all throat clearing, that I'm going to tell you what I remember, and I have a good memory, but it's not perfect. I have learned the hard way that things are not always in. And also, artists are not the best judges of their own work. You know, Robert Burns had that great poem, I would to God the gift he gives, to see ourselves as others see us. Artists lose all proprietary authority over their creations when they're finished or abandoned, take your pick. So I will now get to the what part of this story. Just checking my timing here. I first encountered Sherlock Holmes, I was introduced to him, as you might say, by my father, who was not an interesting man. He was highly literate, he was an excellent pianist, and he was a psychoanalyst. And he gave me the stories. I was about 11 years old, and I wolfed them down very, very quickly. I'm not a fast reader, so I don't know what very quickly really means. But I was very taken with these stories, and Holmes reminded me of somebody, and I realized that the person he reminded me of was my father, who would talk about his work. When I was a kid, people said, what kind of doctor? Your father's a doctor. I said, he's a feelings doctor, which my dad was nice enough to say was the best description. But later, when I was in high school, people said, oh, your old man's a shrink. Is he a Freudian? And I didn't know. So I said, Pop, are you a Freudian? And he said, it's a silly question. And I said, why is that? And he said, because it's no more possible to discuss the history of psychoanalysis and not begin with Freud than it is to discuss the history of the discovery of America by Europeans and not start with the Vikings or Columbus, but to suppose that nothing's happened since the Vikings is to be pretty doctrinaire, pretty rigid. So when a patient comes to see me, I listen to what they say. I listen to how they say it. I am especially interested in what they do not say. I am curious. What are they wearing? Are they on time? What is their body language? I am, in short, searching for clues from them as to why they are not happy. And I said, gee, Pop, that sounds like detective work. And he said, well, it is like detective work, in a way. And then I suddenly, the light bulb went off, better late than never, that my dad really reminded me of Sherlock Holmes. And then I found myself wondering, how much did Arthur Conan Doyle know about the life and writing of Sigmund Freud? And the first thing that jumps out is, oh, they're both doctors. Well, they both died in the same town, within 9 years of each other. Sherlock Holmes is a cocaine addict. Yes. And Sigmund Freud, for a time, was also a cocaine user. And all these ideas are sort of rattling around. And something else that my dad said that made a terrific impression on me. He said, you have to understand because a lot of people take pot shots at Freud. It's a very popular occupation. That if every theory that Sigmund Freud ever enunciated turns out to be wrong, it would still not discount his claim to genius. And I said, I don't get that. If his theories are all wrong, how could he be a genius? And he said, because the proper comparison to Freud is Columbus. Sigmund Freud was the first non-artist. Sophocles and Shakespeare beat him to it. But Sigmund Freud is the first non-artist to set foot on a hitherto unknown, unexplored continent called the land of the unconscious. And if his maps were subsequently shown to be in error, does anybody remember or care that Columbus thought he was in India? So all this stuff was kind of rattling around in my head, not being the sharpest knife in the drawer. It rattled around for like over 10 years. The big show when I was a kid, in growing up in New York, was My Fair Lady. And we all went to see My Fair Lady, and we listened to the album, and I thought, gosh, this is familiar. Henry Higgins of 27A Wimpole Street with Colonel Pickering just back from India, and the house presided over by Mrs. Pierce. Must live down the street from 221B Baker Street, where Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, just back from Afghanistan, blah, blah, blah. You can get where this is all going. Shaw ripped off Sherlock Holmes. There wasn't any question in my mind. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. If Pygmalion made a great musical, Sherlock Holmes should be an even greater musical. Well, we know how that turned out. So then I was off Holmes for another 10 years. In college, I didn't pay any attention to it. Then back in New York, after I was graduated from the University of Iowa, I was in a bar one night chatting up with a lady who looked kind of good to me, and until she said, well, where was Watson wounded? I said, what? And she said, yeah. And what was his middle name? H. What's that? What was the name of the landlady? And I don't remember what became of her, but I do know that I went back and started rereading these stories and reigniting my curiosity about Freud and Holmes. In 1971, with my head full of this stuff, I drove across country to Los Angeles, where I'd never been. I didn't know anybody, to seek my fortune in the movie business. This may be the moment to relate one of my favorite anecdotes, which you will be fascinated to learn is not about me. Somebody recommended a general to Napoleon and said, this guy is a very good general. And Napoleon said, I know he's good, but is he lucky? You're looking at lucky. So I get to Los Angeles, and I find an agent, and I start writing, I don't know, television, movies, or whatever it is I was doing. But all the time, this was when I discovered that there were books about Sherlock Holmes that hadn't been written by Arthur Conan Doyle. The writings about the writings. I didn't have a lot of money, but I kept spending it on this geeky stuff. Sorry. And reading about Holmes and music, and Holmes and women, and Holmes and the subway, and I don't know what all else. And just absolutely fascinating. And this was feeding into my Freud Holmes idea somewhere. I take it you all know that Freud was a big fan of Sherlock Holmes. That was like his bedtime reading, and he enjoyed that stuff a lot. And he actually had been compared in his own early lifetime to Sherlock Holmes, and apparently originally he didn't like that comparison. There was some Italian guy who detected art forgeries, and he thought that was a better comparison. But then later in one of the case histories, he writes, "I followed the labyrinth of her mind, Sherlock Holmes-like, until it led me to the..." So I thought, well, you know, I'm getting warm here, that's for sure. And then what happened was, the Writers Guild of America, of which I was a proud member, went on one of its periodic strikes. Sometimes these are good things, and we wound up with residuals, and other times we wound up with Donald Trump. You think I'm kidding, but unfortunately, when we went on strike, they started doing reality shows. I'm sorry. Let's move right along. So anyway, this was a good strike. This was not a third strike. And the woman with whom I was living at the time said, "Well, now you can write that Sherlock Holmes story that you're always talking about." And she was correct in this, because other than marching up and down outside the Goldwyn Studios in the hot sunshine with a placard, there wasn't a lot to do. You weren't allowed to write screenplays. And so this is how I wrote the first of my discovered manuscripts, The 7% Solution. And thereby changing Western civilization. Sherlock Holmes had been sort of fading, I guess. Nowadays, you can't get in the door. Anyway, I started writing it on a typewriter, and that wasn't working too well. I wasn't getting the rhythm of it. So I got these legal pads and started writing it longhand. And when I finished writing it, it did not, you know, I thought that I could sell it. I thought, I think this is at least publishable. I used to work in the story department at Warner Brothers in New York before I left to go to LA. And I read such bad writing that we were all being asked to read. I thought this was encouraging in a way. So I gave the novel to the agency that represented my scripts. And they had an East Coast office, and they had a literary office. And the lady said to me, "There's really no point in my reading this novel, because I've never read any Sherlock Holmes, so how could I tell if it was any good?" I was younger then, and there were more rough edges, if you can imagine more. And I said, "Putting aside for the moment that you call yourself a literary agent and have never read any Sherlock Holmes, I may say that if this depends on your knowing another book, it's already a flop." This struck me as an unassailable line of argument, and it would have been, had she not hung up a few sentences earlier. So I took the manuscript under my arm, flew to New York, arriving in a heavy rain, something we don't have in California. And I knew one person who was an editor in the publishing business, and I arrived sopping wet at the offices of Macmillan. I said, I'd like to see Jim Needham, and I was astonished to be told that he doesn't work here anymore. The same person might have called first, but I guess I was still reeling from the hang-up. And it also didn't occur to me that people make lateral moves in their lives, in business and stuff. I'm a writer, that was it. There's nothing else. And I said, is he still in publishing? And they said, well, let me check. And they go, oh yeah, he's across town at this other place. So I get on the bus and I find the other place, and he comes out, a little surprised to see me. I'm totally soaked by now. And he says, what brings you back? Didn't you go out to California to do the movie thing? And I said, yes, but I've written a novel. He goes, oh. He says, well, this is basically a nonfiction house. I've tried 5 novels here, and they've been turned down. And I said, look, I'm very tired. I don't know anybody else. Here's the book. And I went back to Los Angeles. And I thought, well, maybe I'll get another idea. But at the moment, I had shot my wad. And I was very surprised when 4 or 5 days later, he called me up and said, this one they'll publish. I said, what? He said, this one they'll publish. They'll publish this. And then I thought, well, I'm damned if those agents of mine are going to make 10% for negotiating a contract of a book they refuse to read, let alone represent. So I had met this guy at a dinner one night, and I said, what do you do? And he said, I'm an entertainment lawyer. And I said, what is that? And he sort of explained it, and I said, so if I ever need a lawyer, would you be my lawyer? And he said, sure. So I called him up and I explained the situation. He said, let me read your book, and we'll get a release from your literary efforts, which the agency signed off on without a... He who laughs last. So, is this good, or are we all getting tired? I was worried about batting cleanup here. Anyway, so he reads the book, he calls me back, and he says, Hawthorne is a non-fiction house. Your book is going to get lost there. Give it to me, I'll take care of this. And after a lot of toing and froing, I wound up at E.P. Dutton, and that's when I found out that the Conan Doyle estate, which is at this point run by a gang of pirates, whose favorite, scheme is sort of blackmail, Captain Sharkey. And no 7% solution, I can tell you. Anyway, that's how I wrote the first Holmes book. And then there was I was being asked to write another one. I was very surprised, to put it mildly, when it became the #1 best-selling novel in the United States for 40 weeks, and my folks didn't recognize me. And then it became a movie, and I sold it on condition that I would get to write the screenplay. And then, mirabile dictu, I got nominated for an Oscar for the script. I lost to Richard Nixon. All the President's Men. Mine was based on my own material. Just saying. Anyway, they asked for another story, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted to sort of get into the Holmes business. But I had an interesting dinner at the home of Francis Coppola about 3 days before he won the Oscar for Godfather 2. And I was talking with him, and I said, "Why did you do Godfather 2?" And he said 3 reasons. One is they backed up a truck with an enormous amount of money in it. And I thought, this is Francis talking, that this will give me the right to fail, or the right to experiment, to put away money for a rainy day and try other things. Number 2, I was curious to see if I could go back to the same vein and mine it for more gold. And number 3, which I thought was interesting, which didn't play a role in my thinking, was, he said, the first Godfather movie troubled me. He said, I thought it was an amoral film. And I wanted to make a moral film. And now I had the clout to do it. I said, okay, let's forget the last one and concentrate on the money and the going back to the... And so I wrote the West End horror, which also, thankfully became a bestseller. And then came along, I like the West End horror. I remember artists are not the best judges of their own work, but I think it's a good story. It's a story about a pandemic, after all. Timing is everything. And then there was a long silence, and a movie deal I was counting on to pay for whatever was happening in my life fell apart. And in 1992, I had to write something. And I was in Daunt's bookstore in Marylebone Road, which I'm sure you've all visited. And I stumbled onto a copy of the novel, The Phantom of the Opera, which I had never read. And in the introduction, somebody said, gee, how curious that Holmes and the Phantom never crossed paths. And I remember looking around and going, is anybody watching this? And that's how I wrote The Canary Trainer. I was getting into a conversation recently about whether titles should be, today titles have to be really on the nose. And today it would be Holmes versus the Phantom of the Opera. And that's the sort of thing I abhorred. I like The Canary Trainer because Holmes people will know at least that it refers to Wilson, the notorious Canary Trainer. And that was good enough for me. When I was starting a book tour for that, my wife was diagnosed as being gravely ill, and the tour was canceled on the first day. And she subsequently passed away. And so The Canary Trainer sort of got lost in the shuffle. It's an attempt to write a Holmes story without Watson. Whether you decide it's a good story or not, again, it's not up to me. But I have kind of a soft spot for it because it's also about music, and I'm a music fool. And so then a long time went by with no more Holmes, because I wait until an idea hits you that is so irresistible that you can't let go of it, or it won't let go of you. And at some point, somebody said to me, who was interviewing me, said, how does it feel to be a forger? And I must say that up to this point, I had not thought of it in just those harsh terms. I'd rather be known as a fille de joie than a hooker. But I thought, well, I am a forger. I don't say it's by Nicholas Meyer. It's always as edited by Watson's stuff. And then I thought, yeah, forgery is an interesting topic. And I started reading about forgery. And I acquired a library about forgery. It's an interesting subject. It has a lot of pros and cons and ethical and moral and economic issues. And it's not long before you come across the biggest, baddest, most vicious and enduring forgery ever created, which is a little number called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion.
Oh.
And as I dove into this particular horror and checked on some dates, it occurred to me that here was a case where Holmes could fail, but it would be interesting to see him try. And that became the adventure of the Peculiar Protocols. And after that, wrapping up, you'll be relieved to learn, my agent, who is somebody who doesn't hang up on me, said, what about Holmes in Egypt? And that was all it took to prime my pump. I had been to Egypt in 1979, and I loved Joan Collins and Land of the Pharaohs. No? Yes. Which brings me in conclusion to the why of all this. I am the last person to understand anything. I said I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. I do things by intuition and instinct. I once had a conversation with my girlfriend. I said, I like Cézanne. I love Cézanne. She said to me, why do you love Cézanne? I go, I couldn't explain it. And it took me a while to understand what it is about Holmes that draws me back again and again. I think Holmes is to me what Nathan Zuckerman is to Philip Roth. He is my avatar. He is the spokesman for the things that are going on in my head and in my heart. All works of art are ineluctably products of the time in which they are created. Mozart doesn't just sound like Mozart. He also sounds like Middle 18th century European music. Renoir doesn't just look like Renoir, he looks like 19th century French Impressionism. I'm in the movie business. If I were to show you 5 movies, all allegedly set in 1776, you could tell within 5 minutes and 5 years when each of those movies were made. 1925, 1937, 1958, 2020. You figure it out. The eyelashes, the costumes, the ideology, you figure it out. Every age gets the Holmes it deserves. I'm a purist. I don't like Sherlock Holmes movies. I just like the stories. And I try to regurgitate them. I'm a forger. But the forger's art suffers if all art is ineluctably a product of the time it is created. My dyspeptic views of the late 20th and early 21st century are reflected in my depiction of Holmes. The crimes, he says, are getting bigger. I wish I had a more cheerful note on which to end this talk, but I hope you will remember the laughs in place of the other stuff. And I thank you again very much for bringing me to Toronto and allowing me to keynote. And I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.
You said something derogatory about a lawyer, and I was sitting right there.
They were American lawyers.
Some of my best friends. I was searching for a word to describe that, and I came up with about 14, and then I thought I would settle on thoughtful. And so I think that's the word I would start with. Now, questions? And I would ask, could you summarize the question, because we don't have a way of recording?
Yeah, but there are no questions.
Well, there will be.
Oh, this gentleman has a question.
Yeah, what did you think of Nicola Williamson in 7% Solution?
I thought he did a great job. What I kept trying to explain to the people in charge of publicizing the movie this is not a Sherlock Holmes movie. This is a movie about Sherlock Holmes. It's different. And as I said before a minute ago, I'm not crazy about Sherlock Holmes movies because I think Doyle is better, is the simple way to put it. But for example, I never understood Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, and I never understood them for two reasons. One is, I don't understand why a genius hangs out with a jerk. And I couldn't imagine that Nigel Bruce wrote the stories that I love. And the other thing that I didn't understand is that Rathbone, who looks like Holmes and who sounds like Holmes, but I don't see the wheels turning the way you can with certain actors. When you look at Gary Cooper or Cary Grant, you can see everything is going on in their faces. And I didn't see the intellectual process. With Nicol, you see the intellectual process. And even though it's not a Sherlock Holmes story, I enjoy him for that reason. But remember, I'm the artist. What do I know? It's just another opinion.
I have a... It says the director is more like a teacher.
If I were to put an analogy for directors, I would say it's the conductor of an orchestra. The director has to know a little bit, as a conductor does, how each instrument works, all the components. You have to know what the oboe can do, how fast it can play or not play. You have to know what the costumer is all about. You have to know what the movie is supposed to look like. You have to be able to hear a still voice in your head that says, this is what I'm trying to do. Because there's going to be a lot of white noise around you from investors, from egomaniacal actors, from weather that refuses to cooperate, and so on and so on and so forth. And you have to be able to navigate that. You have to have a thick hide, and you have to have a lot of physical strength because there's no sleep while it happens. But your job is to coordinate these elements, to bring out the best in the costumer, in the film composer, in the actors, and so forth, and to blend them into a vision, an interpretive vision. In my case, it's sometimes a script that I have written, but sometimes it's a script I haven't written. And you have to sort of figure out and tease out, what does this want to be? What are we going for here? And it's very easy to lose track of that in the midst of, conducting an orchestra in a typhoon, which is sort of what it's like. I think that Henry James said that life is hot, but art is cool. If you are the puppeteer, you cannot be out front sobbing at the performance. You must stay backstage dry-eyed and make sure that the strings do not get tangled. As Robert Bresson said, my job is not to find out what the public want and give it to them. My job is to make the public want what I want.
Ross? So Ross, yes.
You mentioned that the 7% solution was not coming out of a typewriter properly, and so you switched to stylus and pad. Has your relationship to keyboards and machines changed at all? And do you find that the medium affects your message?
I'm more comfortable now with, I'm basically a Luddite. I have a difficulty reading any piece of paper that doesn't start with once upon a time, I'm in trouble. So legal documents, forget it. Anything, bank statements, no. But I do know how to write on a computer. And I've fallen in love with computers for the simple reason that I am not by nature a perfectionist. And if I suddenly have to get out the scissors and the Scotch tape and the liquid eraser, whatever it is, to fix a goddamn comma, I'm not going to do it. But now I can be a perfectionist. I can just worry it to death until I get it how I want it. So I like computers. And I don't know if it still reads like Doyle or not, But again, I'm also at the age where I'm more comfortable with taking chances and sort of pressing the envelope and making things sort of my own and making Holmes into a sort of an avatar. And if it isn't exactly like Doyle anymore, well, you know, send me to movie jail or something.
You have a question?
You used the orchestra metaphor earlier. That's a nice segue into my question. I read the 7% Solution before I saw the film. So when I saw the film, I was very surprised and charmed by the song, I Never Do Anything Twice. I'm just wondering how that wound up in the film.
Well, first of all, I think to have lived in the same age as Stephen Sondheim is as close as I will ever come to living at the same time as Mozart. So I was Stephen Sondheim and Tom Stoppard. Those are they're on Olympus. They're the top of the heap. And Herb Ross had worked with Stephen Sondheim. He was the director of the 7% Solution. And he had worked with Sondheim on Broadway a couple times. And he got into his head that when they go into the brothel, now everybody's awake. When they go into the brothel, that the madam should have a song. And Stephen Sondheim said he'd always wanted to write a dirty song.
Okay, Mike?
Okay, you said that you don't like Sherlock Holmes films, but if they come to you and say, we want to take one of your books and make it into a film, one of your Sherlock Holmes books into a film, number one, which one, right? Number two, do you write it? Do you direct it? Do you do both?
First of all, you know, Dr. Johnson said that a man is a blockhead who writes for any reason other than money. So if somebody comes to me and says, I'm going to write you a check, I'm there. That's number one. I don't know which of my, you know, I think because I'm a screenwriter and a filmmaker, I do write in sort of cinematic language. So I would like to think that most of these books, in some way, would translate into films. I also think
there's a play of West End.
Yes, I know. And the Western horror, this is an uninformed opinion, is the one that most resembles Doyle straight up. It's in London. And I like the fact that everybody in the first week of March 1895, when the story is set, is actually doing the things they were really doing in that first week. It's not important, but I got off on it. Sure, I'd like to write it, I'd like to direct it, whatever it is.
In the 7% Solution, how much is your Freud character interwoven with your father?
How much is the Freud character in the 7% Solution interwoven with that of my dad? Well, let's put it this way. When Alan Arkin was going to play Freud, which was my idea, he said he did an awful lot of research on Freud, and none of it quite added up to, and then he realized it was all about my dad. And, you know, it's very hard to imagine Sigmund Freud shoveling coal into an engine while they're, you know, dashing across the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when Anatole Broyard reviewed the movie in the New York Times, he reviewed the book. He said how cool it was to see Freud, you know, being portrayed as the hero, which I guess in some ways, he certainly saw himself as he saw himself as a conquistador, as a conqueror of mountains. He also said that any mother who sends her son out into the world believing that he's a conqueror, are you with me there on that one? He's likely to turn into a conqueror. That would stand for. So yeah, I guess I was rehabilitating Freud via, you know, sort of honoring my dad.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So you were saying that sometimes an idea grabs you and
Won't
you
let go.
Yeah, won't let go of you. Obviously, given your fidelity to, you know, Conan Doyle, there's certain things that can't be shoehorned in there. So what's something, if there is anything recently, that has just grabbed you that can't be worked in with Holmes, and what are you going to do with that?
You have to be ruthless. As I said, art, you know, life is hot, but art is cool. If it doesn't, or somebody said, throw away your darlings. And by the way, going back to something that you were saying before, I was offered to direct a movie called Young Sherlock Holmes. And I was talking to the producer, Roger Birnbaum, and I said, what's the movie about? And he said, well, it's about Holmes and Watson, how they met at school. I said, no, they didn't. So I was out the door. So that's just, you know, how I'm really an arch conservative where Doyle is concerned, even though I've, you know, fucked around with him. But I try to color within the lines. I like recycling. I'm very big on recycling. I like pouring new wine into old bottles, whether it's Star Trek or Holmes or other stuff. I like the idea, I like the formalism of an English sonnet. I like finding words that will fit into that format, and that's the form that I take. I'll tell you one last story.
Sure, I want to ask you a question after that.
Well, this is my, you know, I'm free associating because you know, I was in analysis, so I get to do that. I was at a party many years ago at a big apartment on Fifth Avenue, and it was all French film people that I really worshipped. And I don't know why I was there. And there was a foyer when you got out of the elevator, and there were dessert tables. And there was a film director, a French film director, who I worshipped. I just thought this guy was the greatest. We had not been introduced. And the hostess breezed by and said, "Oh, X, darling," we'll save his name for a minute, "would you cut the cakes?" And he said, "Okay." And she went away, and I watched this guy start to cut cakes. And I was dying 1,000 deaths as I watched this man cut a cake. Because I don't know about the people in this room, but when I cut a cake, I start in the middle, and I work my way out, and I make pie slices. Not this guy, no. He was doing circles and rhombuses and triangles and parallelograms. And we still hadn't been introduced, and I said, "How come you're cutting a cake like that?" And he didn't look up. He didn't think he was doing anything remarkable, much less important. He said, "Oh, this way everybody can have the size and the shape that they want." Perfect answer. So I left the party, and I started walking up Fifth Avenue. I wasn't on the curb. I was in the middle of the street, hoping that I would be hit by a bus. Actually, before I wanted to be hit by the bus, I had a stupider thought, which was, oh boy, I can't wait to cut the cake like that. And then I thought, you really are an idiot. If you live to be 10,000, you will never cut the cake like that. That was an original action. That was Picasso, is what you were seeing. And you're not Picasso. You will never cut the cake like that. And as I'm walking out the middle of the thing for a couple of blocks, I don't remember how many. And then I thought, okay, you'll never cut the cake like that. But at least you understood what you saw when you saw it. You'll tell other people about it. I'm telling you about it. And that's the kind of artist you are. And so I climbed back onto the curb.
So, you and I talked about this very
What
briefly.
artist was it?
Oh, it was Louis Malle, the only guy who made a comedy out of incest.
I went back and I looked at my favorite scene in the 7% Solution when I knew Nick was coming. And if you remember the movie, there's a meeting at a tennis club where Sigmund Freud is very much an outsider, and the villain of the piece ends up in a game of what's called real tennis. And he's obviously a far superior tennis player, but after a while, Freud figures out that he can psych him out, and he does, and then he ends up losing the tennis game. And then flash forward towards the climax of the film, the sword fight on top of the train, in which, as Holmes is in real trouble, the train's moving along and he's fighting, and Watson shouts out the top of the window at Holmes, "Remember, Holmes, no backhand!" And so I went back and read the book, or the part of the book, and it's not there. So I asked, what's your philosophy of making something that is like so different from the book? I was expecting the book, and I didn't see that in the book. So that's my question. You call it a question.
Whether works of art are ever finished or whether they're just abandoned is an open question. I wrote the novel and it went off to the publisher, and it was at the publisher when I woke up having dreamt that two people in my book were playing tennis. I used to play tennis every day till my knees gave out. And I remember lying in bed and thinking, which two characters are playing tennis? Is it Holmes and Watson? Is it Freud and Holmes? Is it what? And finally I sort of doped it out and wrote it up and called my editor and said, here, there's a couple more pages are going in. By the time it got to writing the screenplay, and as you may know, the screenplay is different from the book. And it's different for a couple of reasons. One is, I looked at it as an opportunity to improve things, not to just be slavish. And the other thing is, I remember when I read Presumed Innocent by Scott Turow, well, you learn who did it when you read the book. So I thought, what's the point when I went to see the movie and I already knew who did it? So I thought, rather than let people just relax and sink into their chairs while they're watching my movie, I'm going to switch things up and see if I can improve things or make things pay off. And so I changed the mystery that Freud and Holmes collaborate on, just to, as I say, perk it up a little bit. And then I had this inspiration about the backhand. And so it didn't make it into the book, but it made it into the screenplay, and it was a nice payoff. Sorry.
Well, so was your dad able to see the book or the movie?
Was he able to see the movie?
Yes, was he still around?
Oh, yes, he did.
Oh.
Yes, he did.
What did he think of it?
He liked it very much. I showed him the manuscript, and he was a very good editor. So it came back with a lot of stuff. But I think they were very surprised by the success of the book and then the movie and the whole thing. It was like, him?
I know we could go on. Actually, your philosophy is you never do anything twice.
Right.
That we could go on for a long time, and I certainly would be happy to second that motion. But I think I first of all would like to thank Nick for I'm sure will go down in the annals of Doylean and Sherlockian conferences as one of the more stimulating talks any of us have ever heard, or the most stimulating talks any of us ever heard, and thank you.